Siamo a Settimo Milanese, siamo in Italtel e siamo con Craig Larman, uno specialista di Scrum. Quindi oggi parleremo di Scrum, ne sapremo di più e capiremo meglio come questo framework può aiutare le imprese ad essere ancora più innovative. Mr. Larman, let me ask you to introduce yourself first of all.
All right. So I have a background in software-intensive product development. And after some time working in software development, I became interested in the question of how do organizations themselves help or prevent the successful creation of products. And that started me on a journey to being involved as a management consultant in organizational design. I then became interested in applying these ideas at larger scale in telecom and other large product development domains. And then over the last couple of years, I've been focusing on applying large-scale Scrum to telecommunications and other industries. And now, for example, today, many telecommunication companies around the world do product development, drawing ideas from our system of thought for large-scale Scrum and large-scale Agile development.
Let's go to Scrum. How Scrum came up exactly?
Yeah, so in the early 1980s, two Japanese researchers were interested in the following question. What were the organizational design characteristics that were consistently associated with companies that were doing a good job at product development? And they looked at case studies from 1978 to 1982, I think it was. And then they wrote a paper that was published in the Harvard Business Review in 1986 called The New Product Development Game. And in this paper, they summarized the research results of these organizational design principles. And I didn't know this before, but in Japan, the game of rugby is a popular game. And so they were looking for a metaphor that kind of described what they had observed. And so the metaphor that they came up with was rugby-style development, and Scrum is a term from the game of rugby, and so Scrum is now a word that refers to or implies the game of rugby, which implies this metaphor, which implies then these organizational design principles. Now, in the early 1990s, a company in the United States, the vice president, a guy named Jeff Sutherland, read this paper and became interested in applying these ideas to his company. Did so, and then started to promote, along with his colleague Ken Schwaber, started to promote these ideas for others to apply. And since the mid-1990s to today, Scrum has just exploded so that now it's used broadly around the world in software-intensive product development, both large and small.
Really amazing the metaphor you made about Scrum and rugby. Could you explain better this aspect?
Sure. So the researchers, Takuchi and Nonaka, looked at companies, and one traditional families of companies developed products like this. They would have separate specialist groups that did partial steps. For example, they would have a requirements or a specification group, and then that would pass on to a separate group that did some architecture, and then that would pass on to a group that did one part of the development of the product, like one part of the software, and then that would pass on to another group that did another little part of the software, and then that would pass on to a separate test group. So in that traditional model, there were a lot of single specialist groups that did partial steps and then passed the work on to other groups. In contrast, in the companies that the Japanese researchers found were the most successful, they applied the principle of cross-functional team, where there was a small team together of people that contained skills for analysis, architecture, software development, testing. And also the people in this small team didn't have a single job title. They wouldn't say, I'm a tester or I'm an architect. Rather, they just thought of themselves as team members who could do different kinds of work. Now, bringing this back to the metaphor of Scrum and rugby, In the game of rugby, a scrum is when all the people are like standing around a circle and they've got their hands on each other's shoulders. And what this implies is that the whole team together is trying to move the ball down the field. There's not separate teams or separate sub-teams that are trying to move the ball part of the way. It's this whole team together that's trying to move the ball down the field together. And in the same way, with a cross-functional team, you've got a team of 7 or 8 people who are trying to do some feature in the product, and this cross-functional team does everything, the requirements, the architecture, the development, the testing, and they move it down the field. Another part of the metaphor is meant to imply that in the game of rugby, in a scrum, everybody's sort of pushing. But it's okay for people to have different primary specialties. So one person in that scrum might be especially good at running, one person might be especially good at kicking. And so people do have primary specialties. But there's a terminology called T-shaped worker, which is meant to suggest that a worker has some especially deep skill, but they'll also have secondary skills, which gives them breadth as well. So for example, instead of in the game of rugby, someone running up to the ball and saying, "Oh, I'm not going to pick up the ball and move it down the field because he can run faster than me. So I'll wait for him to come and pick up the ball and run it." Instead of that mentality of only doing my single job title, the idea is in the game of rugby that people will go to the ball and do what they can to get it down the field, even if they're not the best at it. Because the important thing is not doing my job. The important thing is getting the ball down the field. And if everyone has flexibility or agility with being a T-shaped worker where they can have 2 or even 3 different skills, then we'll move the ball down the field more quickly. And so this metaphor of Scrum is meant to imply the thinking mistake in organizational design called local optimization, where in a traditional, for example, telecom company or many companies,